The stench hits you first, a thick, coppery wave of stale blood, sweat, and fear, clinging to the humid air of the tunnel. You are in the dark, a suffocating, palpable blackness, but you can hear it. A low, guttural roar from thousands of throats, a sound like the sea in a storm that rises and falls with a terrifying rhythm. The sand beneath your bare feet is cool and damp, but you know that in moments it will be scorched by the sun and stained with something other than water. This is the moment before the gate groans open. And now, please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. The man they call Crixus was not always Crixus. Once, he had another name, a softer name whispered by his mother in a language of wind-swept hills and dense, ancient forests. He was a boy from a northern tribe, one of the many that Rome, in its insatiable hunger, had ground into dust. He remembered the flash of steel in the morning mist, the screams of his people echoing through the valley like a death knell. He saw his father, a chieftain with eyes like a hawk, fall under the disciplined, merciless advance of the legionaries. They were not men, these Romans. They were a machine of polished iron and cold calculation. The boy, who was not yet a man, was swept up in the tide of conquest, shackled with hundreds of others, their collective grief a silent, choking cloud. The march south was a blur of dust, thirst, and the rhythmic clank of chains. Hope, a fragile, flickering candle, was extinguished with each passing mile, replaced by a hollow dread that settled in his stomach like a stone. They were herded like cattle, prodded by the butts of spears, their captors' faces impassive, bored even, by the human misery they were inflicting. He learned his first lesson of this new world on that march. His life, his body, his very name, was no longer his own. It belonged to the empire. Upon arriving in the sprawling, chaotic heart of Italy, he was sold. The slave market was a cacophony of languages, a swirling vortex of desperation and commerce. He stood on a wooden block, stripped bare, while men with cold, appraising eyes walked around him, pinching his flesh, forcing his mouth open to inspect his teeth as if he were a horse. It was here he was purchased by a man named Gladiators, a lanista, a merchant of flesh and death. Gladiators was a man whose smile never reached his eyes, a purveyor of the grotesque fantasies of the mob. He saw not a boy, but raw material. He saw a physique that could be hardened, a spirit that could be broken and reforged into something profitable. The boy was given a new name, Crixus, a brand seared onto his shoulder, and a wooden sword. He had ceased to be a person. He was now an investment, a future spectacle of blood and sand. The transition from a free child of the forest to a slave destined for the arena was a systematic dismantling of the soul, a perverted ingenuity of cruelty designed to erase every trace of the person he once was, leaving only a vessel for violence. The ludus, the gladiatorial school, was a crucible of pain and despair. It was a self-contained universe of brutal routine, governed by the lash and the unblinking gaze of the doctores, the trainers. These were often former gladiators themselves, men who had survived the arena but had their humanity carved out of them in the process. They were the ultimate enforcers of the system, their bodies a roadmap of scars, their souls hardened into something akin to granite. Crixus's days began before dawn, with grueling exercises designed to build muscle and stamina until his body screamed for mercy. He learned the grim arithmetic of the arena, the precise angle of a sword thrust to pierce a lung, the most efficient way to sever a tendon, the brutal poetry of a perfectly executed killing blow. He trained with the Murmillo's heavy scutum and gladius, the Retiarius's net and trident, the Thrax's curved psyche. Each weapon was an extension of a philosophy of death, a specialized tool for a specific kind of slaughter. The training was not merely physical, it was a psychological reprogramming. They were taught to suppress fear, to ignore pain, to view their opponents not as men, but as obstacles to their own survival. Comradeship was a dangerous luxury. The man you shared a meager meal with one day could be the man you were forced to kill the next. A chilling, unspoken understanding existed between them, a bond forged in shared misery and the constant, looming presence of death. Gladiators, the lanista, was the dysfunctional tyrant of this small, violent kingdom. He would walk the training grounds, his eyes missing nothing, a flick of his finger capable of ordering a flogging for a perceived weakness, a word of praise, a rare and coveted treasure. He was a master of psychological manipulation, pitting his gladiators against each other, fostering rivalries that would translate into more spectacular, more profitable combat in the arena. He was a monster, but a rational one. His cruelty was a business decision, his every action calculated to maximize the return on his human investments. Crixus learned to bury the boy he had been deep inside, to build a wall of calloused muscle and cold fury around the fragile memory of his past. He became what they wanted him to become, a weapon, honed and ready. The day of his first Munis, his first official games, arrived like a fever dream. The roar of the Colosseum was a physical force, a wave of sound that vibrated in his bones. Pushed from the darkness of the tunnel into the blinding glare of the arena, Crixus felt the heat of the sand through the thin leather of his sandals. The sheer scale of the place was disorienting. A gargantuan stone bowl teeming with 50,000 spectators, a sea of faces contorted in a collective mask of bloodlust. High in the imperial box, the emperor himself sat, a distant, almost mythical figure, the ultimate arbiter of life and death. The dysfunctional tyrant on the grandest scale, whose whims could dictate the fate of nations and the spilling of a single gladiator's blood. The opening procession, the Pampa, was a surreal parade of condemned men, marching in their polished armor, their faces set in grim masks of determination. They raised their weapons to the imperial box and recited the chilling fatalistic oath, Ave Imperator morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor! We who are about to die salute you. Then, the chaos began. The sand, once pristine, was quickly churned into a reddish-brown mud. The air filled with the clang of steel, the grunts of exertion, and the screams of the wounded. Crixus's opponent was a hulking secutor, his face hidden behind a smooth, featureless helmet. The man was a mountain of muscle and rage, his movements surprisingly swift. Crixus's training took over, his body moving with an instinct he didn't know he possessed. He parried, dodged, the heavy shield on his arm a familiar weight. The crowd was a living entity, its mood shifting with every blow. They roared their approval at a well-landed strike, their boos a cascade of scorn for a moment of hesitation. He was no longer a man. He was an actor in their savage theater. He caught a glimpse of Gladiators in the stands, his face a mask of intense concentration, calculating odds, profits, losses. A sudden opening, a feint to the left, a lunge to the right. Crixus's gladius found its mark, sinking deep into the flesh beneath his opponent's arm. The secutor staggered, his helmeted head turning slowly towards Crixus, a silent, questioning look in the eye slits. Then he fell, the sound of his armored body hitting the sand, a dull, final thud. A wave of nausea washed over Crixus. The crowd erupted, a deafening explosion of sound. He had survived, he had killed, and for that, they loved him. Life in the ludus between the games was a strange purgatory. The survivors were afforded better food, rudimentary medical care, and the fleeting attention of women who were drawn to the grim celebrity of the arena. But these were gilded comforts in a cage of death. The specter of the next Munis hung over them all, a shadow that no amount of wine or temporary pleasure could dispel. The camaraderie that flickered between the gladiators was a fragile, complex thing. They were brothers in a shared damnation, yet they were also potential adversaries, their lives measured against each other in a zero-sum game of survival. They would share stories, not of their past lives, those were ghosts best left undisturbed, but of the arena, of close calls and killing blows, a dark and technical language understood only by them. Crixus saw the psychological toll etched on the faces of the veterans. He saw the haunted look in their eyes, the way their hands would sometimes tremble, the sudden, explosive flashes of rage over a trivial slight. They were men living on a knife's edge, their minds as scarred as their bodies. The system was designed to keep them off balance, to prevent any real solidarity from forming. Gladiators would grant favors to some, punish others, his actions seemingly arbitrary but always calculated to sow discord. He would arrange fights between men who had formed friendships, a particularly cruel form of entertainment for the connoisseurs of the games. Crixus learned to navigate this treacherous social landscape, to keep his counsel, to trust no one completely. He became a quiet observer, his senses honed by the constant threat of violence, both in the arena and within the barracks. He witnessed the slow, inexorable erosion of the human spirit, the way men would gradually lose themselves, becoming little more than the brutal caricatures the crowd paid to see. The fame he was beginning to acquire felt like a mockery. Children would play with wooden figurines bearing his likeness, and wealthy patrons would toast his victories. But it was a fame built on a foundation of death and degradation, a hollow echo in the vast emptiness of his stolen life. He was a celebrated object, a prized animal, but never, ever a man. The emperor, a man whose name was a byword for capricious cruelty, and whose personal failings had metastasized into a political psychosis, demanded ever more elaborate and grotesque spectacles to placate the restless masses of Rome. The games became more frequent, the stakes higher, the bloodshed more extravagant. Gladiators, ever the astute businessman, saw an opportunity. He acquired a new set of exotics for his ludus: lions from the sun, scorched plains of Africa, bears from the dark forests of Germania, and most terrifyingly, a pair of gigantic crocodiles from the murky waters of the Nile. These were not meant for the Veneziones, the traditional animal hunts. They were to be pitted against his best gladiators in a twisted display of man versus beast. Crixus was chosen for the honor. The lanista presented it as a testament to his skill, a chance for unparalleled glory. But Crixus saw it for what it was: a high-risk gamble with his life, a sensationalist gimmick to titillate a jaded audience. The day he faced the crocodile was unlike any other fight. The beast was a primeval terror, a relic from a forgotten age of monsters. Its eyes were cold, reptilian slits, its hide a thick, scaly armor that could deflect a sword thrust. The crowd, usually a roaring beast itself, was hushed, a collective intake of breath as the massive reptile was released into the arena. It moved with a deceptive, sluggish grace, its long, powerful tail sweeping across the sand. Crixus, armed with only a short spear and a small round shield, felt a primal fear he had not experienced before. This was not a man he was facing, with predictable movements and weaknesses. This was a force of nature, an engine of pure, unthinking violence. He circled it, his mind racing, trying to recall the scant advice the doctors had given him. The eyes, they had said, or the soft underbelly. Both seemed impossible targets. The crocodile lunged, its massive jaws snapping shut with a sound like a falling portcullis, missing his leg by inches. The crowd gasped. He could feel their morbid excitement, their hunger for a spectacular, bloody end. He was their sacrifice to the god of spectacle. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The cold, disciplined fury he had cultivated for survival was replaced by a white-hot rage, a hatred not for the beast before him, but for the thousands of eyes watching, for the emperor in his box, for Gladiators, for the entire rotten, blood-soaked system that had brought him to this point. The fight with the crocodile became a legend, whispered in the taverns and bathhouses of Rome. Crixus had survived, through a combination of desperate agility and sheer bloody-minded luck. He had managed to jam his spear into the creature's eye, a moment of blinding agony for the beast that gave him the opening to inflict a fatal wound to its throat. He had stood over the twitching corpse, his body drenched in sweat and reptile blood, and had not raised his hand to the crowd. He had simply stared, his gaze sweeping over the roaring mob with a cold contempt that was lost on them. They saw only a champion, a hero who had conquered a monster. His fame, already considerable, exploded. His image was everywhere, on mosaics, on pottery, on the walls of brothels. Wealthy matrons sent him expensive gifts and scandalous invitations. He was the toast of Rome, a living embodiment of the martial virtue they so admired, yet so rarely practiced themselves. But the victory was a hollow one. It brought him no closer to freedom, no respite from the gnawing emptiness that consumed him. In fact, it made his cage smaller, more gilded, but a cage nonetheless. Gladiators, flush with the profits from the spectacle, treated Crixus with a new proprietary respect. He was no longer just a valuable asset. He was a masterpiece, a testament to the Lannista's genius for creating champions. He was paraded at banquets, forced to stand mute and impassive, while drunken senators and aristocrats discussed his physique and his victories as if he were a prize stallion. He learned to wear a mask of indifference, a blank canvas onto which they could project their fantasies of strength and courage. Inside, however, a slow-burning fire was kindled. He began to see the cracks in the system, the fear that underpinned the arrogance of his masters. He saw the way they looked at him, a mixture of admiration and a deep-seated terror of the violence they had cultivated. He was their creation, but he was also their nightmare. He started to listen more intently to the whispers among the other gladiators, the talk of Spartacus, the Thracian who had led a rebellion decades earlier, a name that was both an inspiration and a cautionary tale. The act of rebellion was not a grand, heroic gesture. It was a small, almost imperceptible thing. It began with a refusal. A wealthy senator, a man known for his decadent parties and cruel whims, had requested Crixus for a private exhibition at his villa. It was not a fight to the death, but a demonstration for the amusement of his guests. It was a common practice, a way for the elite to get a close-up view of the violence they so adored, without the dust and stench of the public arena. Gladiators, eager to curry favor with the powerful senator, readily agreed. But when the Lanista came to give Crixus the news, the gladiator, for the first time, said no. The word, spoken quietly, hung in the air between them, charged with an impossible weight. Gladiators was stunned into silence. It was unthinkable. A gladiator did not refuse. They were property, tools to be used as their owner saw fit. The Lannista's face, usually a mask of shrewd calculation, twisted into a mask of pure fury. The refusal was not just an act of defiance, it was a threat to the very foundation of his authority, to the natural order of his world. The punishment was swift and brutal. Crixus was flogged until the skin on his back was a raw, weeping tapestry of pain. He was starved, chained in a lightless cell, his body aching, his spirit pushed to the breaking point. But he did not relent. In his solitary darkness, he held on to that single word, no, like a precious, secret treasure. It was the first choice he had made for himself since the day his village burned. It was a reclamation of a tiny, infinitesimal piece of his own soul. The news of his defiance spread through the ludus like wildfire. It was a dangerous spark in a tinderbox of resentment. The other gladiators looked at him with a new kind of respect, a fearful admiration. He had done what they all dreamed of, but never dared to do. He had reminded them that beneath the brands and the scars, they were still men. Gladiators, for all his cunning, had made a critical error. By trying to break Crixus, he had inadvertently made him a symbol, a martyr. The Lanista could not kill his most valuable asset, but he could not allow the defiance to stand. A different kind of punishment was devised, one that was both a lesson to the other gladiators and a final, cruel twist of the knife for Crixus. The ultimate punishment, the final assertion of the system's absolute power, was to be meted out in the arena, the place where Crixus had forged his unwanted fame. Gladiators, with a flair for the dramatic that was characteristic of his trade, arranged a special match. It was not against another man, nor was it against a wild beast. Crixus was to face Gannicus, the only man in the ludus he considered a friend. Gannicus was a Celt, a warrior of immense skill and a quiet, melancholic dignity. They had trained together for years, had saved each other's lives in the chaotic melees of the group fights, and had shared countless cups of cheap wine in the quiet hours of the night. Theirs was a bond forged in the crucible, a silent understanding that went beyond words. The announcement of the fight was met with a stunned silence in the barracks. It was a grotesque perversion of their world, a new depth of cruelty. To force two friends to fight to the death was not just a spectacle, it was a message. It was a demonstration that no bond, no loyalty, no shred of human connection was sacred. Everything could and would be sacrificed on the altar of the games. On the day of the fight, the two men stood opposite each other on the sun-bleached sand. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. They could see in each other's eyes the shared tragedy of their situation, the bitter end of their strange and violent journey. The crowd roared, oblivious to the human drama playing out before them. They saw only two celebrated champions, a dream matchup. They craved the poetry of a noble death, the thrill of seeing one hero vanquish another. The fight, when it began, was a masterpiece of lethal art. It was a dance of death, each man anticipating the other's moves, their skills perfectly matched. They fought not with the wild fury of their previous battles, but with a somber, reluctant precision. It was a conversation in the language of steel, a final, tragic farewell. In the end, a single, momentary lapse in concentration was all it took. Crixus, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, saw the opening. He could have held back. He could have allowed Gannicus the final victory, but in the twisted logic of the arena, to do so would have been the ultimate insult. The only honor they had left was to fight, and to die, as the warriors they had been forced to become. His blade found its mark. Gannicus fell, a look of surprise, and perhaps even gratitude, on his face. Crixus stood over the body of his friend. The roar of the crowd, a distant, meaningless noise. He had won. He had survived. And he had never felt more alone, more utterly and completely defeated. The victory over Gannicus was Crixus's last. The light in his eyes, the fire that had been kindled by his small act of defiance, was extinguished. He had become the perfect gladiator, a flawless killing machine. But the man he had once been, the boy from the northern forests, was now truly dead, buried beneath a mountain of corpses. He moved through his days in a fog of hollow routine, his victories in the arena becoming more and more effortless, more and more meaningless. He was a ghost haunting the ludus, a living monument to the system's ultimate triumph. His end did not come in the spectacular fashion the crowds might have hoped for. There was no final, epic battle against a legendary foe. It came on a nondescript afternoon, in a standard munus against a young, terrified gladiator from Germania who reminded Crixus, just for a fleeting moment, of himself. During the fight, Crixus simply stopped. He lowered his sword, his shield, and stood, waiting. The young German, bewildered and frightened, hesitated. The crowd, sensing a lull in the action, began to boo. The emperor, annoyed by the interruption to his entertainment, made a subtle gesture. A Praetorian guard, one of the ever-present enforcers of the imperial will, lifted a bow. An arrow, swift and silent, flew across the sand and buried itself in Crixus's chest. He fell without a sound, his face turned towards the sky, his eyes empty. His death was not a tragedy to the spectators. It was an inconvenience, a brief pause in the day's bloody festivities. His body was unceremoniously dragged from the arena, leaving a dark trail on the sand, which was quickly raked over, ready for the next act. The story of the gladiator is a dark mirror held up to the society that created it. It is a story of systematic dehumanization, of the commodification of human life for the sake of entertainment. Men like Crixus were victims, trapped in a relentless machine of cruelty from which there was no escape. Their lives were a testament to the perverted ingenuity of a civilization that could produce breathtaking works of art and philosophy while simultaneously reveling in the systematic slaughter of its own people. The Colosseum, that enduring symbol of Roman grandeur, is not just a marvel of engineering. It is a monument to a profound moral sickness, a place where the screams of the dying were the soundtrack to a national pastime. We look back on it with a mixture of awe and horror, perhaps reassuring ourselves that we have evolved, that we are more civilized. But the echoes of the arena still resonate. The insatiable public appetite for spectacle, the vicarious thrill of conflict, the dehumanization of those we deem other, are these not still present, albeit in different, more sanitized forms? The gladiator, in the end, is more than just a historical figure. He is a timeless archetype, a symbol of the human spirit's struggle against an overwhelming, oppressive force. His tragedy is not just that he was forced to kill, but that he was forced to become a killer, his identity stripped away and replaced by a caricature of violence. His life was a horrific testament to the price of empire, a human cost written in blood and sand, a somber, philosophical reflection on the darkness that can lie at the heart of even the most magnificent civilizations.